All right, let's get started. So we're moving into Unit 4 now. Short unit on distributed genetic algorithms, parallel genetic algorithms, and multimodal optimization. Should be, depending on questions, roughly 2 lectures. And then next week we'll start into simulated annealing. So finally moving away from these genetic approaches and towards other approaches that are nature-inspired and then eventually still evolutionary but very different than genetic, like ant colony optimization and so on. Then we hit some neural network stuff and then kind of get into a little more, just more specific multi-agent. So in the short term here, we're kind of trying to segue from Unit 3, which is this multi-objective optimization, where really the main goal of Unit 3 was to think about how do we take selection pressure in an artificial context like GAs and shape it so that we are going to move it both. So if we really think about it, what is the point of these multi-objective genetic algorithms? They're shaping selection pressure to do 2 things, to move toward and along a Pareto frontier. And so now we all know what Pareto frontiers are, and I know now that we're at the end of a unit, so I'm about to post an assignment, kind of a little concept assignment based on Unit 3 that sort of gives you the opportunity to practice how well you sort of know about things like Pareto frontiers and things like that. So that's coming up there. It's almost all the way done. Maybe today after office hours I can get it posted. But so that's kind of the 2 foci here, is that before we were just trying to sort of manage selection pressure to find a single point, but now we're trying to sort of deal with these multiple objectives, and we come up with a bunch of different ways that all are just trying in different ways to kind of refactor this pressure of how do I move toward a frontier and then along it. And in some ways, you can actually think about how can I combine these approaches, which I've just framed in terms of kind of generic, numerical, multi-objective optimization, in other interesting ways, things you might use for your final project or just kind of conceptual mapping of other projects in the future. Like, for example, we talked about genetic programming. You could do multi-objective genetic programming where you actually get a suite of programs that come up along the Pareto frontier, some of them that maybe are optimized for energy efficiency, some of them that maybe are optimized for, computational complexity, and then you could study along the Pareto frontier how you get, what happens if you move from like one niche to the next. So if you're in a niche where the trade-off has been focused more towards energy and less about computational complexity, you suddenly notice as you slide toward computational complexity and away from, I don't actually know if these 2 things trade off with each other, I'm just giving 2 objectives that might trade off against each other, then you might see some interesting signatures of adaptation toward one objective away from another. And so that's an example where it doesn't just have to be numerical optimization. Or if you want to get more conceptual, you could think of a large school like ASU. We have a gazillion schools, right? Within, we have several colleges and within them several schools. And you can think of each one of them as a community of optimizers in the kind of academic multi-objective optimization scheme. So you often hear about ASUs like the number 1 most innovative school in the nation, right? So innovation is apparently an objective that is really important. But we also have a business model, so revenue generation is also important. And those 2 things sometimes will coincide and sometimes will trade off against each other. So if you want a portfolio of innovative schools, you probably will have some that are going to be more innovative and some that will be less. You might have, you might say, well, you know what, this is a very innovative university, but I don't feel like the classes inside engineering are that different than the classes I get at any other school. And that might be the case. But that might be because the engineering schools might be trading off more toward, providing training, and that, training in order to make sure that you have a sort of a very, clearly marketable degree might bias you away from innovation. But then you might go towards smaller schools that take more risks, and they're more biased towards innovation. And ASU has a portfolio of all of them. So some of those schools, you might say, well, there's no trade-off there because they're just different. Like if it's anthropology and engineering, you normally don't think of those. Those are just kind of different. But We have a School for the Future of Innovation Society. We have a School for Arts, Media, and Engineering. And these all are formed under both pressures. We want to give people, make employable, we want to respond to market pressures on one hand, but we also want to change the way people look at things on the other hand. And so you can't do both simultaneously at all times. So instead, you come up with a community of solutions, and students themselves sample from where they want to be on that Pareto frontier. And so a university is itself, you can view it as a Pareto frontier. And then you could ask yourself, I know when I build artificial systems, like evolutionary systems, how do I maximize diversity along the frontier? Well, I know that if I purely just put in an innovation pressure and a revenue generation pressure, I'm probably just going to get two classes. I'm going to get a group of innovative maximizers and a group of revenue generating maximizers. How do I get something that trades off in between? And you could use your experiments with artificial evolution of numerical optimizers as a way to suggest different ways to organize maybe a human organizational structure. So, anytime we have an opportunity to go in and reshape a human-generated structure, you're doing the same thing that a genetic algorithm is doing when it's reshaping a population of optimizers. And so you possibly could say, how do you give incentives to faculty? Well, maybe you can do it in such a way that looks like one of these, these multi-objective optimizers, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I'm hoping you to take away from this. Not only how do I build a multi-objective numerical optimizer, but how do I use a multi-objective numerical optimizer as a model for building a portfolio of Pareto optimal maximizers, be it in the terms of genetic programming or managing organizations or whatever. So we basically said that, at least in the genetic algorithms literature, there's three ways that we think about that. And that's, and just as a reminder, there are the weight-based approaches, which are all these ideas that I am going to penalize, or I'm going to promote a particular weight and then try a different weight and promote it, and then try a different weight and promote it, or alternating objectives. And both of these effectively use a mechanism of moving targets. And so the idea is, at least locally, you might be attracted to one mixture or one pure objective, but then you switch the pure objectives around, or you switch the mixtures you're looking for around, and by switching them over and over and over again, then hopefully you spread your solutions out over a trade-off between all of your objectives. The other way, the more direct way, now, and so these are almost like running independent genetic algorithms against each other or in parallel.
Why do you want
multiple? So the idea here is that there's multiple objectives that you might want to maximize, but there might be a conflict between them. So it's not.
I get all that, but we want innovation and we want the SC to be effective. Mm-hmm. Why don't we think that there's some optimal balance between those two things?
Well, there is, but we.
Pareto frontier, but you think that we only care about innovation half as much as we care about costs. So there's a different point on that frontier that's actually invested.
Right. Well, if you know what that is for sure, that is the only way we can do innovation is if we've got exactly that balance. Then you just build an optimizer that's exactly that. But the idea here is that if you don't know that and you're afraid of you asserting it ahead of time, you might be wrong. Then the idea is, can you eliminate all the solutions that aren't good mixtures of that? And so then come up with possible ways, different ways to trade off between these.
But isn't this defining what the goal is? So it's not that you don't know what the goal is, you're defining what the goal is.
Well, you're defining that there's multiple aspects of the goals, and so there are multiple different, a phenotype is multiple mixtures of characters. It's a different way to mix different characters. And we know that in certain environments, one character might be more important than another. But the idea is that you might not know what environment you're in. So as an operations researcher, you want to provide the trade-off criteria so you can say, if you really want more of this, you're going to have to give up a little bit of this. There's no other way like that. In the best case scenario, you have to give up this. And that's what we're really trying to understand is what are the trade-offs between that? That's really what the frontier is about.
Which means there is an empirical fitness function somewhere that you don't actually know what it is.
That's the idea, is that right now all we know how to do is we know how to measure along all of these dimensions. We don't know what the right mixture of these dimensions should be. But we can hopefully use what we do know about the objective measurements we can measure across this to sort of reduce it to a simpler subjective problem. So rather than just saying what are all of the possible things you could do, you could say, well, let's just restrict that to a set of things that we don't, at this point, we have no objective way to tell you where to be on this, but there might be some cues from the environment later on that'll say you should be more over here or more over here.
So your goal is really to find out where that falls from here.
That's right. That's right. And so there's a moving targets approach, and then the kind of second generation or third generation, depending on how you look at it, were these Pareto ranking approaches. And so that was our third, and that's really the modern way to do this. And the Pareto ranking approaches are nice because by counting the number of solutions that dominate other solutions, you can guarantee that you're going to move closer and closer and closer to the Pareto frontier. The downside of these approaches is by simply ranking, you are allowing the diversity along the frontier to be totally non-deterministic. Here, you at least know there's tension that's stretching it around the frontier. You may not get in the interior, but you know at least you're going to probably get solutions close to either objective, but you don't necessarily know you fill out the middle. Here, you probably put some in the middle, but you don't know that you spread out. So that's why with the Pareto ranking approaches, then we got all of these things like fitness sharing, which we introduced last time, and where each individual, so if an individual has a particular fitness, so this is individual's fitness, then that fitness gets divided by the count of nearby individuals. And then where nearby is usually defined in terms of the criteria space. So if you are an individual and you happen to be very, very close in all K criteria to some other individual, you may as well be the same individual. And so we are going to take whatever fitness whatever rank, so in terms of Pareto ranking, so whatever fitness you have is going to be divided by the number of individuals nearby. And that will hopefully slow down the selective pressure in this region so that other regions have a chance to catch up. And then the other alternative, which we'll talk more about primarily next time, are these clearing approaches, where it's a similar idea. It's clearing, if that's not that readable. And where in the clearing approaches, it's you do something similar to this, but instead of dividing fitness, you effectively take, here you're focusing on one individual's fitness and dividing it. Here, you're looking at all the other individuals and getting rid of them. You're effectively setting fitness equal to 0 of several that are nearby others. And then you're giving then another avenue for mutation to generate a new individual somewhere else and then allow it to go through. These are two common ways of promoting diversity along the frontier. And so, but what's interesting, and the reason I'm going over this again, which we'll get to the main topic today, is that here there's sort of a natural kind of parallel or distributed structure here, because it's almost like you're running independent GAs in parallel. Whereas down here, we've almost introduced that parallelism again, because what the goal when people came up with fitness sharing and clearing approaches was to have sort of an unsupervised clustering that generated almost discrete clumps of individuals along the Pareto frontier, effectively bringing us back to sort of running parallel GAs. Like, what this allows things to do is it's sort of by sharing fitness among nearby individuals, those individuals kind of compete with each other, and then the group of them competes with other groups. And so it acts a little bit like exactly what they were doing up here, just with a very different mechanism. So in the end, we start seeing that as people think more and more and more about diversity, they're coming up with more and more clever ideas that are arguably inspired by at least some idealization of biology for how to promote diversity. And they started discovering very interesting dynamics that then came back to reshape the original genetic algorithm to make it even better at promoting diversity. So that's what we're going into now, is parallel and distributed GAs. Let's just take this idea of running GAs in parallel and see how that changes the single objective problem. And what more can we do with the single objective problem if we can effectively really promote diversity. And it's what's interesting to me, and I hinted at this last time, is that ideas which have not taken a hold, that are still very controversial in biology, in explaining evolutionary trajectories, that don't really have a lot of evidence to be useful in biology, tend to actually very well explain these problems. And so they were created by biologists for biology, and they were bumped into accidentally late through the engineers doing this, as and if only we were just accepted that evolution in action was a topic that we all should be talking about within one classroom, then maybe it wouldn't have taken 10 years for them to realize that somebody had already invented this wheel. So that's what hopefully I'm also trying to get to here. So before moving on to distributed and parallel GAs, are there any questions about this multi-objective? Coming out of it, this is the old unit, we're moving on to the new unit. These three general approaches for trying to spread things out along the Pareto frontier. Get to the frontier and spread along. Creating communities of multiple niches. All right. So multi-objective, from multi-objective to single objective on multiple processors. So naturally, there have been many approaches at many GA in parallel approaches or parallel genetic algorithms. And you can imagine a bunch of you just take a GA and you notice there's a bunch of things that probably could go on in parallel. You're evaluating an individual's fitness. Well, you don't need to wait on evaluating one individual's fitness while you can evaluate two fitnesses in parallel. If those two individuals exist at the same time in the same generation and you have enough processors, you can just evaluate all the fitnesses at the same time. So there are a bunch of parallel approaches, some of them that kind of have a master-slave topology to them. So you might distribute part of the process to some master processor, and then it sends individuals off to some slave processors. They calculate fitnesses in parallel. It all comes back together. You can see how you could do all that, but that's just boring HPC stuff. So that's just like your standard, uninventive, the kind of naive thing that you'd expect anybody to do once you gave them enough time. So what's a more kind of bio-inspired approach? Which may or may not be a good approach. Like maybe the HPC approaches are the better approaches. But the kind of bio-inspired approach, you say, well, I've got multiple parallel resources. So how do I sort of think about where we get evolution in action happening across parallel resources in biology? And so people started thinking about these things called islands or subpopulations or demes. And so usually when people refer to as distributed genetic algorithms, these are ones that capitalize on subpopulations, otherwise known as demes, which is borrowed. So I'll say, it's similar to something that a term deems. So in biology, if you have subgroups that primarily mate with themselves and may have sort of a relatively high amount of relatedness relative to some other subgroups, but may have some limited migration between them, then they use this term demes. And I always thought that there was, when the term meme came up, it was sort of unfortunate that the person who's now who popularized meme, who's now popularized on Twitter for something else right now, it was unfortunate that they didn't like to me, deem and meme sound so alike, and there's so many ways you could take cultural evolution and think about demes and like little groups where these are the people who really like cat jokes and all these, like it seemed like you could have been a much deeper analogy, but instead the reason memes, even though it sounds like demes, memes is just because it's mimetic. It's like it's mimicking a gene. But I think there's opportunity there to expand the term meme to have sort of more formal way of embracing the term deme. But deme is just sort of generally a group of individuals that primarily swap genes amongst themselves and not with others. Yeah.
If there were more research papers on these subjects, I think we'd all read a lot more.
Absolutely.
There are a lot, but I just think we don't incentivize having to go out and read outside of particular bubbles. And there's just a time commitment. It's a trade-off. But, so demes. So the idea here is this is going to be like Vega-like. So if you remember in vector evaluated genetic algorithms, we evaluated effectively subpopulations on different objectives in parallel. But if you imagine in Vega, if you had used all the same objective, then you're going to get something very similar to these distributed GAs. And so the idea is, let's say each processor, and of course this processor, could further parallelize on top of that. But for now, let's just think of each worker or each processor is going to run a simple GA with, one objective. So they all run the same objective, one objective, I'll call it F. But it does that with a smaller, you can think of it as doing it with a smaller population size. Instead of running 1 million individuals, I might run 100,000 individuals 10 times, like 100,000 here, 100,000 there, and so on, or 100 individuals even more. So you can think in terms of Vega. If you'd like to think about this, you could think I've got n individuals divided by k processors, and so that's maybe how we're distributing that: n individuals divided by k processors. And then periodically, and this is the important thing. And so exactly what we mean by periodically will be what we'll get into. But periodically, we migrate individuals between these processors. And so, for example, a common approach is to keep track of elites. So you move elites from one processor into positions formerly held by low fitness individuals on other processors. So you run a simple GA for maybe a couple of generations, and then periodically you move the ones that do really well from one processor, and you have them wipe out individuals that are not doing so well on another processor, and then you let that go again and see how well those elites do. So they sort of reinitialize this on these other processors here. And so this idea of having these populations that interact borrows from ideas of so-called metapopulations, because you can then ask questions about how that each processor itself becomes like an individual. You can say, what are the demographics on this processor? What are the demographics on this processor? You can then connect these metapopulations in restricted ways as they do. So you could imagine a processor is at every vertex here, and it only exchanges individuals with those along this graph. And so then you can ask, what happens to the demographics of these processors as demographics change here? So you can start studying the individual processors as individuals, and so the population of populations becomes an interesting population in itself, a metapopulation. So then there's a lot of degrees of freedom to play with here. like the topology here, for example. How frequently do you mix, and do you mix freely among, or just among a little neighborhood, and so on. Anna.
Sorry, if you've already covered this, you can tell me that. But is the motivation for running it on separate processors at all that each objective is hard to evaluate, and so therefore you say?
Oh, well, so we've now moved on. So I just want to say that this is all one objective now. So we have moved back to we're out of multi-objective anymore, and now we just are interested in optimizing a single objective.
And so why do you have multiple processors at all? Just because you imagine that you can't simulate everything on one processor?
Initially, people moved into this area because they said we have lots of parallel processing ability. How best to parallelize the GA? And the idea is we're just going to speed it up. But the thing is, this organizational structure changes the dynamics of the GA. The same way it changes the dynamics of evolution in real systems. And so then the question became, did we break the GA? That was the worry. Will a GA even work this way? Because let's think, how did we change the dynamics here? So what's special about this setup here? Well, for one, we have smaller populations. So we used to have 1 million individuals, now we have 100,000. We used to have 100,000 individuals, maybe now we have 100 on each processor. What problem do we get into in evolutionary systems when we go into small systems? Drift. Drift becomes dominating at small, very, very small population sizes. In other words, just the random resampling can kill all of your selection. You would really like a very well-performing solution to do well, but if it doesn't do really, really, really well, then just by chance, if it doesn't take over the whole population, then some others might end up crowding it out. And once it's gone, it's gone. So small populations put high fitness solutions in more liability than they would, to the point where small enough populations effectively have no selection pressure. And so drift becomes more prone to drift. So I'll get into this in a second, but this whole model and the way people think of it has been motivated by shifting balance theory. So the whole Sewall Wright's idea that you could potentially get through adaptive valleys by making use of drift at small population sizes. Now, Fisher and a bunch of others have basically, there's a bunch of arguments against this in real populations, and this might be so slow and we'll get to all this in a second, this might be so slow in its action that it wouldn't be realistic for real, because the fitness functions would sort of change too quickly in real systems. But in these systems where your fitness function is held constant, then it might actually be perfect for this Wrightian approach. All right, so, and then, the other cool thing about this, so this is where subpopulations, not only they're small, but if you think about it, drift is random. So what's really exciting about that is your different populations will drift to different places. So drift in cross subpopulations means that these subpopulations become a new source of variation. And that is the weird thing that makes this special from just your average subpopulations. And so different populations drift to different locations. So you got 10 individuals here, and maybe an individual with red shoes will get favored just randomly. You got 10 individuals here, maybe an individual with a green shirt will be favored, just randomly, and so on and so forth. And then suddenly you've got the red shoe population, the green shirt population. Green shirts would have never been found here, red shoes would have never been found here, but then we migrate, and then suddenly you've got a red shoe individual and a green shirt population, and vice versa. And so that was a thought that maybe this could become, we've already got crossover, we've already got mutation, maybe this is yet another way to introduce variation that could be useful. So, so then the question is migration here. So we've got smaller populations, and then we can either do frequent migration or infrequent. So this is migration. Now, if you do frequent migration, then basically it's not a subpopulation. It's not a metapopulation anymore. If you're just every generation sending everyone from here off to a huge number of these and vice versa, you've turned it into a well-mixed population anymore. So too frequent migration gets rid of any of this subpopulation effect. So too frequent, we get no diversity across pop. But infrequent migration is that migration will not beat drift. So basically, in my red shoe, green shirt example, if every 100 generations you put a red shoe in a green shirt population, drift is going to kill that red shoe. Like, just those green shirts, you're just going to, it doesn't matter how exciting a red shoe is. You can, quadruple the number of red shoes there are, but there's so many green shirts, even if they're only double each individual green shirts, then you're still going to more likely just get rid of the red shoe. So if you had a way to figure out the right amount of migration here, then in principle, you would have a way to allow drift to have some function, but not dominate everything. And so finding that sweet spot might be an interesting thing here. And also, you do have a couple other levers you can use to hold back drift. Remember, we're just running a standard GA. Back in whatever it was, Unit 1 or Unit 2, I talked about all these diversity mechanisms which you can apply to your individual GAs on each one of these little sub-processors. You can do fitness sharing, for example. So you can slow down selective pressure and drift using different mechanisms that we've already used in order to sort of give you more flexibility in deciding on this migration. So there's a couple of different degrees of freedom to find the right balance here. So that's something else that I'll add in here. So I'll just mention maybe in another color other levers as well. And so by other levers, I'm referring to all of those other tricks that we've already covered on how to slow down fitness, slow down selective pressure, or reduce drift, and so on. So there are things you can do to amplify selective pressure if you need more of it, or to get rid of it if you need less of it, and so on. But ultimately, you're trying to find this right mixture here. Now, what do I mean this right mixture here? So, everybody okay with this so far before I swipe to the next one? Yeah.
I guess I'm just not understanding how you would avoid, let's say you get one of your subpopulations that's really functioning well as red shirts. Mm-hmm. You suddenly introduce the green shoes people, mm-hmm. right, or whatever it is, right? Now you've taken a very strong subpopulation and actually made it worse, depending on what your single objective might be. So I'm just trying to figure out, like, would you have some quote-unquote elite populations over others, and then you wouldn't want as much migration between those?
You wouldn't want migration. Well, I mean, the idea here is that, we only evaluate fitness in terms of individuals, but it just so happens that there are subpopulations that might become very low in diversity. So you get a bunch of individuals that are very, very similar to each other. But ultimately, if there's migration between these populations, you still think that if one of these populations evolves some adaptation that's really much better than all of these, if you give enough time, then it may spread throughout the whole population. And so the idea is you're trying to use this team of genetic algorithms to hopefully amplify the ability to find fitness peaks that might otherwise be very difficult to find.
But at the end, you're not choosing one of those subpopulations. At the end, you're pulling from all the best individuals from your total population.
Right. At the very end of this GA, you'll pick from all the elites in all of these different subpopulations. But the idea is you want to make sure that in the whatever 10 subpopulations you have, or however many these are, that you actually hit the global optimum. Yeah.
I wonder how often it happens in this kind of scenario that the red shirts was just
I mean,
Does
well,
that ever occur? Like, do you have that kind of problem?
well, I guess because we're exerting, I mean, ultimately, there is only one selective pressure on all of these, and that's the one fitness objective. And so I guess the thought is that if you had a really good mixture and you broke it out, it would be, not only would it would be at a disadvantage due to the drifting, but it'd also be a disadvantage in terms of fitness. And so the real question would be is whether one mixture is better than another. And if you have one mixture migrates into another where there's another mixture, and if you do it frequently enough, then the hope is that better mixture will suddenly, dominate not only here but here, or something like that. Yeah. Question.
So I'm trying to identify structural advantages to this approach over just a single island.
Yeah.
And the only difference I can see is that we're just limiting recombination, right? With every island, we're saying that these individuals can mutate however they want asexually, but they can only recombine with individuals from the same island, right? So
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So that seems to be the only real difference between this and the stuff we did earlier.
That's right. That's right. Yes.
Are there notions of like speciation in genetic algorithms that would also do the same thing, right? Because speciation restricts recombination. Is that a concept that exists?
Yeah, so by the way, these are referred to as island models. I'm glad you said that. I meant to write that somewhere here, but each one of these, they're not only deans or subpopulations, they're also called islands. And so they have multiple islands, and they've got this little bit here. And yeah, you certainly could get populations that are viewed as species, and that it would be so weird for them to recombine with some other species that like they're pretty much never gonna leave the island. Or if they do leave the island, they're going to have to take over all of these. You're going to get enough of them that there's a good enough chance you're going to get recombination between them, or else because if you recombine from this one to this one, the offspring just aren't viable. So that definitely can happen in these. And I think there's probably interesting experiments that you can run that that might be looking for that. But I think especially if you did this as a multi-objective, you might end up finding like different. Each species might actually kind of be fit for one of those niches, like this trade-off or this trade-off. I think that's fine to do. I don't know a lot of. I'm sure that people have thought about multi-objective distributed genetic algorithms. I'm not an expert in that, but it wouldn't surprise me if people sort of more go in exactly the direction you're talking about there. But we do have this question of why would this possibly be better? And
I mean, the drift is higher here, even compared to a population in which you forbid recommendation of whatsoever.
Yeah, the main function, the reason why this might be better is actually because you actually are amplifying drift, and that's actually going to be a good thing in a weird way here. So I guess maybe I misunderstood the question, and thanks for the clarification. Is that this is not like I'm taking a million individuals and then I'm taking those million individuals and spreading them out. By spreading them out, I'm actually increasing the role of drift, which in the past we thought was a bad thing. But we're going to find that when it's organized in this way, it has the potential to be a good thing.
Pretty interesting.
Yeah.
I thought it was purely because of the restriction of recombination that allows for perhaps more diversity or possibilities, not that we're reducing drift.
Right. Yes. So the next slide here is the kind of conceptual model that gets into that. But yeah, that was the idea. Is initially they said we have got a computational budget, so we've got to distribute individuals across these, but it's going to increase this drift. Is this still going to work? And then to their surprise, they thought that this would just be faster, but maybe not as good as GAs. But to people's surprise, when they did it on here, they actually found that these found global optimizers much faster than the single ones. And so we'll see potentially why. We don't exactly know. Things are getting so complicated. It's not quite it's getting more and more like biology. And biology it's very difficult to know exactly what's going on. And so that's the downside of any meta-heuristic is you lose your ability to say for sure exactly what's going on. But we know empirically that these distributed GAs are faster when you have these multiple modalities or multiple modes, and you need to find this one global optimum among many possible locals. So why might that be? Gesundheit. So biologists were often interested in wondering how natural systems would solve this problem too. So there's this guy, So maybe I'll write this in different color here, but this is a guy named Sewall Wright, who's sort of one of these famous theoretical population biologists, along with statisticians like Ronald Fisher. And so Sewall Wright had these ideas of these adaptive fitness landscapes. And so his idea was that if you picture these, fitness peaks, you could imagine that we're in some space of solutions. So you could think maybe along here, these are, potential. You can think of these as genotypes, potential solutions, maybe genotypes. And then you can think of this as some fitness. And so the big problem was this. These so-called adaptive valleys. And so the problem here was that if you were a bunch of individuals stuck on up here, let's say, it's super steep on the sides of this landscape, or within the landscape on this hill, it's super steep here, which means there's really high selective pressure up here. Which means you're pretty much, natural selection is going to push you up the hill. Now, if there was another peak somewhere else, like let's just say, maybe I'll draw this one artificially higher. So if there was another peak that you would like to get to, it's going to be almost impossible for your population to get over here. Mutation's not going to move you that far. Recombination isn't really going to get you that far. You're just not going to innovate here. So how do you get this sort of punctuated equilibria where suddenly you get individuals that show up on this hill and beat out all the others these individuals here? This is not physical space. This is like solution space, strategy space. And so all of the individuals, if you have individuals that pop up on this hill, they're living with these individuals. But if you could show up on this hill, if you're in a region of selective pressure, then these ones will beat the pants off of these ones, and gradually your population will shift over here, and they'll find this point here. So this is like that optimization objective we really like to get here. But the problem is that there's so much selective pressure that any individuals that start migrating down to the adaptive valley are going to get killed before they have a chance of wandering up this peak. So how the heck do you get from here to here? So what Wright thought is, he said, well, what if you set up exactly what we've set up in this distributed genetic algorithms? You have subpopulations with high drift that periodically migrate. And so in those cases here, I just write, maybe I'll just, so we got separated demes with restricted gene flow. And so there's periodically these events which allow for migration. And so this was the so-called Sewall Wright's shifting balance theory, which was later discovered by evolutionary computation people as a way to explain so-called punctuated equilibria or quantum evolution, which has nothing to do with quantum computers, in these evolutionary landscapes for evolutionary computing. And so how does shifting balance theory work? Well, the idea is that there's three things that happen. So there's one, we've got our small population sizes. We have then high genetic drift. And I guess I could write this as shifting balance theory. So small population sizes, genetic drift is strong within those populations, so within each pop, with each, I'll say, subpop. or deem or island or whatever you want to call it. Now, because of that, then you get the downside of genetic drift is you don't have any selection pressure. But we say that when you have selection pressure constantly sort of favors exploitation just before stagnation. So if you get rid of selection pressure, a bonus, as long as you don't drift so far to fixation, is that you get exploration out of that. So this promotes exploration, because drift, if I were to, and I'll go back and forth here, if I had killed the selection pressure here, drift would allow individuals that show up here to persist. They potentially, if you had no selection pressure, who cares if you're this individual or this individual? So this one gets to hang around for a little bit longer. So drift gradually allows you to move into these adaptive valleys. So drift promotes exploration. And I could say into the valley. I'll say kills selective pressure. So then once we've got them in the valleys, then the next thing is that they sometimes will get pulled up into, we haven't totally killed the selective pressure. So if you're lucky enough to get into the valley and then to get up the other side of the hill, so if you manage to get down here, if you can manage to get on this side of the hill, then gradually you can get selective pressure tugging you up in this direction. So it's possible that drift will allow you to find neighboring valleys. So I'll put that as 2 as individuals in valleys can sometimes be pulled up new fitness peaks. And then finally, 3 is where we get migration. So then migrants from subpopulations at higher fitness peaks send off migrants that can move those subpopulations to new peaks. And so the idea is, so then we have migration sends off individuals at new peaks to join and compete with other subpopulations. So there are these 2 famous evolutionary biologists, Wade and Goodnight. They wrote it. Yeah.
Professor, so the very reason why they were going to the first peak, if you could go to the previous slide. Yeah, the very reason why they were going to the orange peak in the first place was the selection pressure and all is fine, but because your objective function was rewarding them to go towards that peak.
Right.
As long as you have the same objective function, how do you expect them to come down from that peak and reach the other one or go towards the valley in the first place?
Well, that's the idea, is that if these subpopulations are small enough, then eventually, the idea here is that naturally selective pressure is going to get smaller and smaller as you get toward the top of that peak. But drift is going to make the point at which selective pressure turns off lower and lower and lower. And so just by random chance, so you look like you disagree there. So that the idea here is that drift, the smaller and smaller the populations are, the more and more chance there are that those will survive to the next generation purely by random sampling because you have a small population that is restricted to be a small population. So the effect of selection pressure, which will again normally turn off as things get more and more close together, then that threshold where selection pressure turns off gets lower and lower and lower as you have drift. The idea is if you had really small populations like 2 individuals, then pretty much this adaptive landscape doesn't matter. Your individuals are just going to show up randomly throughout the solution space.
Yes.
Yeah.
So following with his doubt, so I don't understand why they go down again, because when you recompile one individual, the best individual is somewhere close to that weight, and let's say the worst individual is somewhere closer to the value. So when you recombine, it'll be somewhere in between. It still goes around.
Well, so recombination doesn't necessarily always interpolate. It also can kind of extrapolate. And so just the fact that you combine two individuals doesn't mean that, this individual and this genotype, this individual and this genotype, if they happen to recombine, that doesn't mean that the offspring is going to be in between them. It could also be on either side. In addition, not all of them are recombining. So they've got mutation, they've got recombination, these happen at low rates, and then drift is happening. And when drift is there, drift is sort of, it's any of these selective effects just get minimized more and more the more drift you have.
So basically.
Well, actually, that's the question.
Well, how do you ascertain that the drift takes you to a value and not a feedback again?
Well, you don't. So, I guess the idea is that drift can only move you so far, and so mutation will move you a little bit, and drift will ensure that as mutation moves you down into the valley, you won't get killed. So drift is there just to turn off selection so that other processes like mutation can move you down into the valley.
I was going to say what you said in other words. So one term that biologists use is mutation selection balance. So the populations always have the mutation selection balance. In other words, mutations make these dots move around randomly. Selection makes them move towards the peaks. And if they're both equally strong, that's where the population stays. So there's a constant influx of noise from the mutations and a constant reduction of noise from the selection that moves them up the peak. But if you would just imagine that mutation is really high, right? There's constant influx of a huge amount of noise that spreads all the points around. And just by random chance, some of them land in the valley and some land on the other side of the valley and so on, right? And so having smaller populations is just another way to have a relatively higher level of mutations, right? It's that influx of noise is suddenly higher. It's nothing to do with specifically attracting them to a valley or anything. It's just that you basically have this shotgun approach, where if the population is smaller, if you have a big population out of 1,000, every once in a while you're going to have this really weird mutation that's really far away from where you are now. But out of 1,000, the chance that that one survives is practically zero, right? But if you only have 5 individuals and one of them has a weird mutation that moves them all the way across there, then the chance of that individual surviving might be higher, right? So it's just this influx of noise through mutations becomes more important in the smaller.
And I remember last week I mentioned I posted a recent article that came out about these mammoths that they sampled the DNA from on this small island, and they found that they just had a ton of these deleterious mutations. And the thought was that because they got islanded, drift took over, and selection couldn't get rid of some of these deleterious mutations. And so they basically, had individuals that were living much closer to the adaptive valley. If they were living in a large population of mammoths, then those other individuals would push them out, and these ones wouldn't have survived. But on the island, when there's only a few of those mammoths, then that meant that selective pressure that would normally weed them out kept them down here, which is why we have fossil records of them. Yeah.
I just don't understand why when we have small populations, we have reduced selective pressure. I don't know why.
Right. So this is one of the hardest things to kind of wrap the head around it. And the idea would be that if I go to the extreme case of just like 2 individuals,
okay.
And so.
But we're gonna select based on relative fitness, right? We're gonna select based on the fitness divided by the probability is gonna be based on the fitness.
But again, it's a probability. That's the thing, is that it might be that I am much more fit than the other individual, but I have to be a whole lot more fit than the other individual to guarantee that if there's only 2 of us, that my offspring will take over both spots in the next.
Imagine Ted is more fit than anybody here, but he gets run over by a car.
Well, sure.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. So that's just, if you only have 2 individuals, by random chance, the great individual has all the traits to be eaten by a hawk or whatever you're talking about, right? And then all those variants are gone, and all of a sudden everybody's in the valley.
Right. I mean.
1,000 individuals is unlikely that all the ingredients die.
Yeah. I mean, if you imagine that you've got this one individual has 4 offspring, and the less fit individual only has 1 offspring, or maybe 2 offspring if I'm doing the restricted to 2 case, then in the next generation, if there's only room for two of you, it may be there's a greater chance that that some of these are going to make it into the next generation, but there's at least a non-zero chance that this will be the next population. And there's at least a very high chance that I'm going to get one of these individuals and one of these individuals. And so if I had high selective pressure, then I pretty much could guarantee that if I have a bunch of these individuals, then it's much, much more likely that they're going to take over the population. Yeah.
So Professor, the main trick over here is keeping everything constant. Just make your population smaller, because in smaller population there's not going to be presence of an elite who takes you towards the minimum, but rather some local guys who are going to not take you towards like a maximum or whatever it is, but give you chances for exploration around.
That's right. So the weird thing that maybe people didn't expect is that these DGAs allowed you to balance exploration and exploitation in a way that single processor operations did not. So it allows for additional exploration within these islands, and so each island can explore nearby and then can export the good ones that it found to other islands. And so this can kind of keep going, churning more and more and more. And so that migration sends off these other things. And so there's this nice, like I said, Wade and Goodnight had this nice paper in 98 where they coined, I think, this phrase, small experiments in evolution. And so the idea behind shifting balance theory and then DGAs is that what you're doing is you're basically saying, rather than wanting to run one big experiment that has high selective pressure, that is very likely to find one peak, you're going to say, I'm going to run a bunch of cheap experiments in parallel and allow them to just go wherever they're going. And then periodically, we're going to come together in some committee meeting, share ideas, and then go back to our islands. And then run this over and over again. And so that is what these small experiments in evolution was doing in this kind of DGA. And you can think of this like, now we have things like random forest regression, and there are all these voting models where you train 10 different neural networks, and then you all have them vote on what they think they're seeing, and you take the majority of that. You could sort of all take all of those and project them down into sort of like joining a class that's like this. And this is a kind of a genetic algorithm version of that pluralism that we've already capitalized on in those other technologies. And so that's kind of the beauty of this shifting balance theory. And so this has not been sort of shown to hold up as being a useful explanatory tool for a lot of things in biological evolution, and there are a lot of arguments for why that might be the case. For one, it might be that you can't hold this one fitness objective kind of constant for long enough for this to happen, or it might be that, as Wade and Goodnight argue in their paper, that actually this is, depending on the questions you're answering, if you're trying to say how do you get innovation over billions of years, maybe this is a very good explanatory model. But if you're wondering about how do you tune that innovation over shorter time scales, then maybe this isn't a very good model. So maybe you're just asking two different questions. But when we're doing these evolutionary computation, we effectively get to live in both worlds, and we can take from this. And it seems to kind of do pretty well explaining what's going on with these DGAs, because these DGAs tend to do better than the monolithic GAs. And so that's kind of fun again. And so I'll mention these two terms that if you haven't seen before, the pop up in the evolutionary computation world of punctuated equilibria, which also comes from biology, and quantum evolution. And it's just about these ways of how you spontaneously find very different innovations in space. And maybe DGAs are one way to get there. So, as I gather thoughts, are there any questions? Yeah.
I don't know, is this kind of a way of trying to say why this works better? Is this proven that these are the reasons why we are getting a better solution using this? Or we are trying to have some kind of a proof?
Proof.
Just to restate whatever we are getting is correct.
So all we have is theories that help us make sense of phenomena and make predictions. And so in shifting balance theory, you might make the prediction that if you were to divide up a population in these islands, as such, and restrict migration, then you would get maybe an improvement in the way in which the populations find these optima. And it might hold up. Now, do we know for sure that that's what's happening? Could there be another theory out there? It's possible. It's really, really, really hard to say in biology. It's a little easier to say maybe here, but even here we're approaching a level of complexity that all we have are theories that just help us wrap our minds around it. And I'm okay with that. To me, there are no electrons. There is just a model of matter that helps me predict whether I'm going to fall through the floor when I take the next step. Now, there might be some enterprising graduate student in a building, say right over there, who is doing an experiment right now that cannot be explained by the standard model of physics, and she comes up with a theoretical model that does not have electrons, but much better fits her data. And then, I just, in 10 years, we just wouldn't have electrons anymore. We already did that with the force of gravity. There is no force of gravity, but that was, Newton had, the force of gravity worked pretty well until it didn't. And now we have, space-time and curvature and all that sort of stuff. We got rid of that whole idea, and yet we still use the force of gravity every day to do, when we throw a baseball, describe where it goes. We don't, these models end up still being useful, even though they might not be accurate. So it's never a good idea to ask, is my model, especially like neural networks and things like that, like they just happen to fit the data. So it's never a good idea to ask, is my model correct? It's just a good idea to ask, is my model useful and predictive? And then it might not be eventually. So we should never be so prideful, never have the hubris of saying, I figured out how it works. Because I will guarantee you that some axiom that everything rests on may end up being shown to not be true someday. And so the best we can do is just say, could I make a better prediction today than I did yesterday? And if I did, that's good. I sleep better at night. Okay. So any other questions before we sort of project into what we'll talk about next time? All right, so that's distributed GAs. Now I hope you can see that over time we've been building up more and more conceptual frameworks to understand things like diversity and selection pressure. So we went into a single objective optimization and we said, all right, this kind of makes sense. We're going to have this sort of basic idea of evolution, and maybe it'll be able to find a peak. And look, for simple functions, it does a pretty good job. It's not perfect, but it's still, we can imagine this is like a good approach. And then we said, well, now we have these populations, and what other things we can do? And that allowed us to drift into multi-objective and things and all of that. And that posed new problems that we solved in new ways, allowed us to reach out to find new conceptual frameworks to understand them. And then now, enriched by all of this work, we can go back and think more about the single objective, as we sort of started to do here. And we now know that we have just so many more tools to manipulate exploration, exploitation, diversity, selection pressure, and so on. And so that's kind of what we're going to then do for the second half of this unit, so this short unit, is that, is we're going to go back to the canonical GA. And by the canonical GA, I'll call it CGA, I mean just your plain old single processor GA. We're saying, given that what we've learned about running GAs in parallel, running GAs with multiple objectives or whatever, how can we go back to just thinking about a single objective solved on a single processor, at least abstractly solved on a single processor, no forced parallelization or anything like that, to make the GA better. And so the idea here is that if we can amplify diversity while maintaining selective pressure, then maybe we can come up with a community of optimizers for a single function. So what do I mean by that? Then you can think about it like, well, maybe I can come up with an evolutionary approach to peak detection. Now, maybe that's not as exciting of a problem as global optimization or multi-objective optimization, but it's a problem. How do I find all of the peaks of a function? And so diversity here is not just about how do I explore the space to find the optimum, but it's how do I distribute, how do I allocate my population according to where these peaks are so that everyone settles out in a peak. And if I have enough of a population, I find all of the peaks. And so this is kind of like, it's very similar to finding all of the niches along a Pareto frontier. And so that's this so-called multimodal optimization. And basically what we're going to do on Thursday is, as I would highly recommend, so when I have this in a small class, I make this a required reading Gesundheit, and then we'd all sit around in a circle and then we talk about a paper. So it's a little too large to maybe do that, but you can find under this unit, there's the paper that is sort of the subject of Thursday's lecture. And so I'm going to recommend that everyone try to skim through it, and then we'll chat about that paper, because that paper is sort of a nice survey of all of the different ways in which they have come up with kind of niching-like solutions to solve this particular problem of how do I allocate my population among peaks, as opposed to the simpler problem of how do I just find the biggest peak. And so that's kind of where we're going. And so you can think of it like an unsupervised clustering. I don't know if because you still have an optimization objective, and so it's kind of projecting on frameworks that aren't quite there. But it is sort of how do you create dynamic islands in parameter space. That's kind of what we're shooting for. So without getting into stopping there, are there any questions or comments or concerns? Yeah, I'm sorry?
Yeah, can you get something like a Pareto frontier based on how you vary population and all that, and how DGA gets affected? I don't know, an illustration or an image
Sure.
of that.
Yeah, I mean, you absolutely could build. We talk about hyper heuristics, and you certainly could build some Pareto frontier of hyperparameters. So, hyperparameter 1 or hyperparameter 2, and you could sort of then imagine there's some trade-off among your hyperparameters. Absolutely, you could use MOGA to talk about MOGA or whatever. So I definitely think you could go that way, and that might be an interesting project to consider. So, anything else? All right, well, that's all I've got for you today. Thanks.